Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dursey-Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, December 17th, if you can believe it, and we will hear the presentation, Retrofitting Bedroom Communities for an Equitable and Sustainable Future. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the questions box located in your GoToWebinar tool panel. For content questions related to the presentation, again, just type those in that questions box, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters for 2021. Thanks to all of those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, we're sponsored by the APA Housing and Community Development Division. So thanks to you for joining us in 2021 and for hosting today's session. The session has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing. You can record your credits by heading over to planning.org, log into your My APA account, and from there you can either search by today's title or the event number, both of which can be found on our website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And for those of you that need to get your credits in by the end of the year, we have two on-demand sessions available. One is good to fulfill your ethics requirement and the other for your law requirement. And you can view those on demand through the end of this year. To get the links to those recordings and all of that good information, again, just head over to our website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Up at the top, there'll be a couple tabs, and I believe it says maybe on-demand webcast or on-demand something. So click there, and you can get those credits logged. If you're on social media, be sure you like us on Facebook. That's where I post any important information like date or time changes. I also try to send out weekly reminders of what session is coming up next on the pipeline. And last but not least, we record all of our sessions and we post them onto our YouTube channel. So please subscribe to us so that you get notified when new sessions are loaded up onto our channel. And I encourage you to take a look, peruse around. We have well over 350 videos of quality sessions for you to take a look at. So that's the end of my housekeeping items. Again, if you have questions, type those in your questions box. We'll get to those at the end of the Q&A. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Rachel and Bernadette and kick things off.
Excellent. Thank you, Christine, for that. I will just pop in. My name is Rachel Smith. I am with the APA Housing and Community Development Division. Happy to bring this session to you today. I will be off camera for most of this session, but you will see me back again at the Q&A towards the end. And with that, Bernadette, please take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much. So can everyone hear me all right? Great. Hi there. My name is Bernadette. Great, thank you. My name is Bernadette Austin. I am the Executive Director for the Center for Regional Change at UC Davis. And today, on this Friday afternoon or morning over here on the West Coast, you're joining us for a discussion on retrofitting bedroom communities for an equitable and sustainable future. And so today, I'm joined by two of my esteemed colleagues, Casey Lazon with the Sacramento Area Council of Governments, where she serves as Deputy Executive Director for Planning and Programs, as well as Christine Corrales from the San Joaquin Council of Governments. She's a Senior Regional Planner over there. So today, I'm going to give an overview of, well, what is the context that we're talking about for this particular topic, as well as the geography that we're looking at today. And then I'll turn it over to my colleague Christine to talk about addressing social equity in suburban landscapes. And finally, we will have a presentation from Casey on accelerating suburban infill for climate and equity. As we indicated, there will be plenty of time for some Q&A, so please do put your questions in chat. I welcome my panelists when they're not speaking to respond to some of the questions if possible, and we will also be saving those towards the end as well so we can answer them via audio. So thank you so much for joining us. I am really, really impressed that we are currently at over 500 participants, which is really impressive on the last Friday before a couple big holidays. Go to the next slide. So I provided a little bit of welcome for who we are today. And we'll just kind of continue on from here. So what are we talking about? So for those of you who are not familiar, I'm sure you are all familiar with California, but what is the scale we're talking about? California is more than twice the landmass of New England. And importantly, some of my data is actually telling me that California has over 12 million residents more than Texas, which is the next most populous state. So we're talking about a really, really large state. However, we are going to zoom in on one of our particular regions. So let's talk a little bit about California Central Valley. So you may have heard with the most recent census data from 2020 that we actually lost residents proportionally, again, with millions and millions of residents. It was a relatively small amount, but we are looking at a net out migration. However, if you look at the Sacramento region, the San Joaquin County area, we actually grew. And while those numbers are small, when you take them in totality, we grew in a way that that the state was actually, losing a lot of our population. So we see that Central Valley, kind of the study area that my research project has been looking at, has seen a increased growth. And so we look at some of the interviews and focus groups that I've been working with the University of Southern California and Occidental College on, has been trying to understand what are some of these factors. Those same factors that are driving people out of the state are driving folks from higher cost communities into communities like the Central Valley, where traditionally there has been lower cost. And I wanted to go back and just share one other perspective around California. So some of you may be thinking, that California is somewhat monolithic, and it really isn't. We have really great, and I'm sure that you're familiar with the fact that we have great ethnic diversity. We also have great income diversity, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. We also have really significant political diversity, and we see that really manifested here. So those of you may think California is a blue state. When I look at election returns, California is home to Nancy Pelosi. It's also home to Kevin McCarthy and Devin Nunes. So you really have to think that we have, again, great political diversity in addition to the economic, racial, ethnic diversity that we have. So let's talk a little bit about the study area that we're looking at for today and for this project that I've been working on. So first, orient yourself by finding San Francisco. So that's sort of in the center when you're looking horizontally, and laterally it's more on the left side. So you can probably find San Francisco. In white are the counties. So San Francisco is both a city and a county. The lighter blue shade indicates where the Bay Area is, and then the darker blue shade is the outer Bay Area. The study area that we're talking about for today is the darkest color, that sort of purple area. We may be bringing in some of the themes for the green areas, which are other parts of both the Central Valley as well as the Sierra Nevada foothills. That's just a little bit to orient you on where we're located. So in California, I'm sure you've heard about our high cost of living, and most notably our high housing costs. So in California, we see, of course, higher housing costs in many areas in the country. So for example, we see that it's roughly $2,000 a month for a 2-bedroom fair market rate. I'll note that the median home price for November was $708,000. That was up from $700,000 the prior month. And that really tracks. To give you a perspective of what we're talking about when it comes to housing costs, we are seeing, again, depending on where you're looking, housing costs increasing by 10%, 12%, 25% a year. It's really just accelerating. So where we saw maybe an average of 4 and 5% housing cost increase year over year, in the last couple of years, it has increased 12%, I believe, from 2019 to 2020. And 25% housing increase from 2020 to 2021. So not only do we have high housing costs, they are rising. San Francisco is has one of the highest housing costs in the world, not just in California. And so you see the fair market rent of roughly $3,500 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment in San Francisco. I highlight this because when we look at the areas in blue below that we're talking about today, those rents are less than half. So not only is the Sacramento metro area and the San Joaquin County areas below California averages for both rents and housing prices, they are substantially a half or a third of the cost of Bay Area prices. So when you have these communities that are directly adjacent, that's really going to have some pretty significant implications. I also want to highlight not just housing costs, but what are the incomes? In a moment, we're going to be looking at some slides comparing households that make under $25,000 a year and over $150,000 a year. I just want to give you some perspective. In San Francisco, the area median income for a 4-person household is $133,000. Compare that with San Joaquin, which is $75,000 annually. So again, we're talking about almost half of the income levels. And that is really one of those factors that contribute to the housing costs. All right, so let's get into some of the mapping. So we're going to look at a couple of maps of these, trying to remember in your brain, orient yourself. On the left side, you'll see a physical peninsula, so that's Silicon Valley. And on the right side, you see sort of those gray areas that border on the Nevada border. That's the Sierra Nevada foothills. It's not really populated because so many of those areas are national parks, for example, state and national parks. So let's first talk about net migration. At the beginning of our conversation, we were talking about people moving out. So people overall from between 2010 and 2020, we had a net migration out of California. This data is just going through 2015. So there are, of course, a lot of COVID implications and also some economic implications, but you can imagine that some of these patterns are holding steady. So the red color shows where you see people moving into that area, the red and orange colors, and the green and blue areas are where people are moving out. So if you look at the San Francisco sort of Silicon Valley area, you see more blue and green colors. People tend to be moving out of those areas. The red and orange areas you can see are further inland, and those are some of the study areas that we are talking about today. So in comparison, so now we're going to compare. When people are making below $25,000 a year, and I really want to highlight that in California, given the housing, the cost of living, that's really low. I mean, that's well below what we call the California poverty measure, which is what we think is a more accurate representation than the federal poverty line. But if you look at these two maps in comparison between the lowest income populations and higher income populations, again, I want to highlight that in San Francisco, a 4-person household is average area median income is actually pretty close to that, over $150,000 a year. But just in comparing these two maps, we see a couple of topics emerge. Where are folks at different income levels moving? So we see that there's just a lot of areas on the left side with the lowest income populations that are green and blue. That means that people are being very much displaced. So the question is, where are they going? But you see that folks are even being displaced from some of the Central Valley communities, and that's pretty notable. I would say that that talks about displacement pressures overall throughout the state. But we also look to the right and see the red and orange areas, and you see a lot of in-migration you see a lot of people moving into the area of higher incomes. We see a greater proportion. If you look at that red at the base of the peninsula, that really is sort of the heart of Silicon Valley and their residential areas. And so it's notable that where people are really being forced out of a majority of the communities when they're lower income, the higher income populations are able to move within sort of that Bay Area and Outer Bay Area. The other thing I want to highlight is you see some of the same areas highlighted in red and orange on both maps. This speaks to some of the housing growth. So there's a lot of growth in that sort of the center, horizontally center, vertically top of the map, which includes the Sacramento region, as well as the San Joaquin region. So we have people across a variety of income levels who are moving into these areas. And so I'm sure that you'll be hearing about that more. All right, so I'm going to actually turn it over. I'm sorry, one more thing I was going to highlight. So what did we not look at? We looked at kind of migration patterns, and we talked a little bit about housing costs. We're not looking at transportation. I really want to highlight for those of you who live outside of California that some of our communities that are mega regions driven by a significant economy have a very robust network of high-speed, high-quality transit. I think of areas like New York, Chicago, and Boston. So what does that mean for bedroom communities in California, which are much more car dependent than comparable communities like the ones I've just described? We really want to think about what are the unique challenges that face what we consider the Northern California mega region. Municipal planning organizations, or MPOs in California, play important planning roles as well as some funding roles in transportation investment. They're also playing an increasing responsibility in regional housing needs allocations, which you may know guides which areas are going to have need to have the most housing growth, as well as some of the affordability levels. MPOs are increasingly working together to address challenges like the ones that we see here in the Northern California megaregion. This megaregion, we believe, is comprised of three particular MPOs. One is the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, or MTC, which focuses on the Great Bay Area, and then SACOG and SJCOG, which you'll be hearing more from today. So now with that, I'll turn it over to Christine Corrales.
Hi, can you all hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. So again, my name is Christine Corrales, and I'm a senior regional planner with the San Joaquin Council of Governments, and I serve as the staff lead for SJCOG's work in regional housing, community partnerships, and clean mobility projects. And so thank you all for tuning in today to listen to some of our projects and work. So next slide here. One more, Bernadette. Okay, here we go. So first of all, I just wanted to really appreciate how critical it is for research and data analysis to inform regional planning, and especially for equity and inclusion. So what Bernadette kind of provided, the overview and the context of the migration data in our particular part of California, it really demonstrates how trends like demographic change, migration, commute patterns, and even development are really critical to understanding the context that MPOs like SJCOG and SACOG are planning in the megaregion. And so in addition to the sources of data that Bernadette shared and the trends outlined here on the screen, SJCOG has also been working to create a more inclusive outreach and engagement process to really gather input from the communities themselves on what the challenges and needs are on the ground. And so I just wanted to highlight in the last regional plan update that we conducted in 2018, we really implemented some new tools and strategies to really help us significantly increase the representation of underrepresented communities, specifically our racial and ethnic diverse region and our low-income residents in the planning process. And so in San Joaquin County, 70% of our population is non-white. And so that's a pretty significant chunk of people who live here in the region. And in past planning processes, they weren't as well represented, but in the more recent update, we really made sure to turn up the volume on what we were hearing from these communities. And so with the robust community input that we've heard in recent years, in addition to some more robust data analysis, we're really using this to inform the projects and the planning studies that we are putting forward to really advance equity and mobility justice. And so today I'll briefly touch on three projects at SJCOG to show how the region is responding to the needs here in our San Joaquin County. Next slide. So the first one I wanted to highlight today is our Easy Hub integrated transit mobile ticketing project. And so through SJCOG's ongoing planning efforts, transit riders have really indicated a need for assistance with trip planning and ticketing. And what's unique about the transit ridership population here in San Joaquin County is that these are folks who are truly transit dependent. It's pretty small or rare thing to see a transit rider of choice in San Joaquin County. And so when you think about the demographic of who uses transit, usually it's folks who don't have access to a private vehicle, folks who can't afford to have a private vehicle. And so that's really the audience that we are targeting with this type of improvement. And so in response to the needs of this transit ridership community, the agency went to work on studying the feasibility of implementing an integrated transit ticketing mobile app to make it easier to access our transit services here. So SJCOG convened 7 transit operators throughout San Joaquin County over the last 2 years to implement and develop Easy Hub, which is a one-stop shop transit app where people can plan, they can discover the routes to get from point A to B, they can plan their trip, and then they can purchase their tickets all in one app. And so by integrating this new technology to improve our transit services here, these are improvements that overwhelmingly benefit a transit-dependent population in San Joaquin County, making transit access easier for those populations. Next slide. And so here's another project I wanted to highlight for you all. This project is the San Joaquin County Displacement Risk Assessment. So what we heard in our last regional plan update from residents and stakeholders is that they were really concerned about this issue of gentrification and displacement. And at the time, SJCOG wasn't really prepared to think about it or incorporate these topics in our planning efforts. And so what we've done since then, since we heard from our constituents in 2018, is that we put some resources towards studying this issue. And so out of UC Berkeley, there's a project called the Urban Displacement Project, which has developed a methodology to assess the risk of displacement, looking at change over time on a number of really key demographics like race, income, and education levels. And they applied this methodology in San Joaquin County, but without much outreach here in the region or even dialogue with key stakeholders. And so when regional and local stakeholders took a look at the UDP model and what it said about San Joaquin County, there's kind of a mismatch of what local folks understand is happening on the ground. And so SJCOG partnered with Enterprise Community Partners and with UC Davis Center for Regional Change with the aim to ground truth this Bay Area model with local baseline data and to engage local communities in a dialogue around this specific issue. So on the screen before you, you'll see a side-by-side comparison of the original UDP methodology on the left side, and then the adjusted UDP methodology on the right, using San Joaquin County baseline data. And what you can immediately see in comparing the left and right hand maps is that much of San Joaquin County is considered low income on the left side. But when you look at the right side map, what you see is that much of the map is actually exclusive to low income populations here in San Joaquin County. So two very divergent narratives, one with a Bay Area perspective and one with a local perspective. And so what I wanted to just kind of say here is that by adapting the UDP methodology in San Joaquin County, the project really illuminates a much more dire picture of equity and inclusion in the region. It's countering a predominant narrative that the region is affordable and accessible. And it leads planners, it leads our policymakers, and it leads our residents to ask the question, you know, affordable and accessible for whom, right? And so from this research, the region is now preparing a menu of local and regional policy strategies to ensure that the region and our localities are prepared and feel informed to address equity and inclusion in the housing sector, and especially as it relates to our planned transit investments. I know Bernadette mentioned earlier the transportation component, and in San Joaquin County, what we have is a lot of planned investment in rail connections to the Bay Area and to Sacramento. And so a lot of the literature points to implications of these types of investments in accelerating neighborhood change and displacement. So that's kind of the impetus behind SJCOG's work on this specifically. And next slide. So one last project I wanted to highlight for you all is SJCOG recently started work on the Stockton Mobility Collective project, which is funded by California Climate Investments. This is a pilot program of the state, and it stands for, it's called STEP, and it stands for Sustainable Transportation Equity Project. And so the project responds to really well-documented mobility challenges in the region's most disadvantaged communities, primarily centered in our South Stockton neighborhoods. And so one of the challenges that it tries to respond to is that transit service frequency is limited here, service hours are really limited, and so Part of the project deploys EV car share and electric bike share services in our most disadvantaged areas. Another kind of key challenge is that there's a lot of first and last mile challenges to access the transit, and our hope is that the shared mobility services help kind of close that gap. There's also a really poor air quality issue in our region, and the programs and services that we're deploying with this grant are going to introduce clean transportation, low emission transportation options. And last and not least, there's also kind of a human component beyond what we've just already addressed, is that there's a lot of ingrained poverty and unemployment that disproportionately impacts residents in South Stockton. And so the project hopes to introduce some workforce development and shared mobility incentives to really close the gap between the residents who most need this service and making sure that they can access them. And so I think the last thing I'll just kind of close out here with is some key takeaways for the planners here today who are looking to ensure equity and inclusion in their work, is really take the time to understand the communities that you serve and do this through data analysis and research. But on top of that, really listen to the community members, that what they have to say about their challenges and needs. And lastly, let the data and the community input really help shape the policies and the projects that you're developing at your agencies. And most importantly, just really ensure that the benefits that you're trying to generate in your projects and policies, make sure that they reach those with the greatest needs. And so I'll end there and pass the mic back to Bernadette.
Yeah, no, sounds great. And I'm going to turn it over to Casey with the Sacramento Area Council of Governments.
Thank you. Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are in the country right now. So I'm going to just jump right in. If you would go, please, Bernadette, to the next slide, to pick up on some threads from Bernadette's context and framing and what Christine had said about the importance of data analysis and research. So I want to drill into the Sacramento region portion of the mega region that was laid out at the beginning of this. So and it really does hammer home some of the trends that Bernadette had been describing. So what you will see on the screen here is annual population growth over a 20-year period, about 2001 to 2000, for the Sacramento region compared to other California regions. Sacramento is the pink line, the San Joaquin Valley, of which San Joaquin cog that Christine is representing is the green line there. And what you see is that while population and growth in the state has slowed over the last several years, the Sacramento and San Joaquin regions have reclaimed their status in the last few years of being fastest growing regions in the state. Next, please. And this is, it's always better to be a growing region than a shrinking region. However, we do have to peel back and understand what is happening and how do we plan for that for those residents. So what I also have to show you here is for that same 20-year period, looking from an economic perspective at jobs in the Sacramento region. So the Sacramento, you've got chunks of bars here. The Sacramento region is the set of green bars. And then we are a mid-sized region. So we are home to the state capital of California, and other peers around the country that we might be compared to are places like Columbus or Denver or Kansas City or Austin. We are not necessarily what you wouldn't compare our region on its own to, say, the San Francisco Bay Area or to the LA area, even though they are, within our same state. And so what you can see here is that what had happened with the Sacramento region as the green bar is that for a while there, we were, like a lot of California, kind of outperforming some of our peer mid-sized regions. That's the second set of bars where you see pre-recession, 2000 to 2008, in terms of job growth. And then when the recession hit in 2008, for us, the core of that was 2008 to 11, we were hit very hard in our region, harder than, as you can see from those the blue bars and the pink bars, harder than the US on average, and our peer regions in the country. And then after the recession, so 2011 to 2020, the Sacramento region did see job recovery, as did the rest of the country, but we were lagging behind behind our mid-sized regions. So when you think about that, while we were recovering, we had a very slow recovery economically. And what we have seen is that the jobs that have come back were different kinds of jobs. We had lost a lot of living wage construction jobs. That industry sort of just disappeared. And those have been, a lot of that replaced with service jobs. And there are implications for that. Next slide, please. One more. There we go, median home value. And this is not to spend too much time on this. Sacramento region is the pink line here compared to other major regions in the state. So home values have been increasing. This actually only goes to the year to February of 2020. And so you can see that the Bay Area, San Francisco is the blue line, with home values increasing so rapidly there. And the Sacramento region being right next door, it was having a significant effect. Even if we weren't seeing, you know, massive amounts of migration from the Bay Area, we were seeing that. And what happens with that is when you have the difference in wealth and the cost of living in a major region like San Francisco, right next door to the Sacramento region, that private market wants to chase those higher dollars that end up wanting to come into our region. And so when COVID hit, our home and rental prices just went even more crazy in this region. Next, please. Layer that on top of a trend in the actual construction of housing. So the state of California has been underbuilding across the state housing for many years now. It was our region, the Sacramento region, had actually been doing fairly well, and then the recession hit in 2008, and we have not been building enough housing to keep pace with our population. What we have also discovered in our region through our planning and community outreach efforts and our research is that we need a lot more multi-family types of housing. So attached housing, whether it's apartments or duplexes or various other types of attached housing, but we need so much more of that to meet the varying income and lifestyle and just living needs of our residents. And while this chart here shows you that the percent of all new homes that are being built by California region that are multifamily, and what you see here is that there were along the coast, San Diego, LA, Bay Area, those are sort of the lines at the top, that there was this what we would call an apartment boom that started to happen in the last decade, but the Sacramento region and the San Joaquin Valley, those other parts of California had not been seeing that. We were not seeing that apartment boom. And you would also say we weren't seeing a lot of single family homes building, and yet we still had some of that. So we were having, what we are seeing here is this mismatch of incomes to housing cost, and that housing cost is also tied to just the kind and location of housing within the region. Next slide, please. Okay, and so I've given you a graphical portrait of the region, but what I want to also do before I move into how we are trying to address these challenges is just give you a physical portrait of the region. So even as the Sacramento region is planning to add, projected to add over 600,000 new people over the next 20 years, it will largely still be a rural place. We have nearly 4 million acres within this region. That map Bernadette showed at the beginning that showed California being larger than New England, I was ballparking in it, and I thought, okay, so the Sacramento region's about half of the geography of New England. So, you know, only about 18% of the Sacramento region is developed, and it's largely suburban development, even as you see just a few little skyscrapers in this photo here. So, we have a lot of ag land. Our development is largely suburban. It wasn't done efficiently, as has happened with most of the development in the latter 20th century. And so there's so much opportunity to build more efficiently, to go back into some of those suburban areas and develop that land more efficiently. And we actually have the potential to do that. Local cities and counties have done laid groundwork to allow for that to happen. And so now, though, the challenge is how do we work within an economic situation that currently isn't really interested in doing that. Next slide, please. So the challenge we are trying to rise to is how do we grow sustainably and equitably in this largely rural and suburban region? And our answer to that, after a lot of legwork, I would say working on the issue of suburban revitalization for over 15 years and trying to find ultimately the funding to do that, we established a funding program for infill infrastructure we are calling Green Means Go. And what I'd like to do is walk you through a little bit of the rationale behind that and what it's trying to achieve. Next slide, please. So my comments so far have been so much about housing, specifically infill housing, specifically attached infill housing. Our region needs to build nearly 11,000 new homes a year to keep up with population growth, and that's over the next 20 years to accommodate those needs. For that housing to also help us meet our climate and transportation and mobility goals, 2/3 of that housing, or about 7,000 homes a year, it needs to be built in infill areas. And a lot of that needs to be in attached homes. So we asked and answered the question among local government officials, market rate and affordable housing developers and builders, and policymakers and housing advocates, what needs to change in order to get more infill development, and especially infill housing development? You've all allowed for it in your general plans. You've identified various locations within your communities. We see that it's not getting built. So what are the barriers? Next slide, please. And the answer boiled down to reduce the costs and risk to do this development. Some of that cost and risk is in the control of local agencies, and some of it's not. For the local government's part, they said, look, with the encouragement of our private and civic sector partners, they said, okay, we can work on local policy changes and planning, like we can try to hone that all. But they said what we need help with is funding for infrastructure, and specifically funding the infrastructure that supports the density of infill development that we need. It's very often cost prohibitive to bring infill housing to market, especially in our inland market of the Sacramento region, because you've got the Bay Area right next door that has the ability to pay for so much more, and yet, in total, the incomes of this region won't go towards the level of rents that you might want to command for housing. So the biggest needs that we saw was, well, can we lower the cost via building some of the infrastructure, water, sewer, drainage, other utility infrastructure upgrades in auto-oriented commercial corridors where the infrastructure there in the ground was built for low density uses, right? Like low density strip malls, low density big boxes, all of that stuff. So what are the places we're talking about? Next slide, please. This is Stockton Boulevard, a former motel block in the city of Sacramento, where the city has already reduced local fees. They've got a density bonus. They've adopted transit-oriented development zoning, but they need drainage and water upgrades to unlock the potential for over 1,000 new homes, 5,000 new jobs. Next slide, please. This is across the street from a light rail station in a suburban community called Rancho Cordova. It's a former suburban strip center. They have a specific plan for this whole thing. They need to pay for drainage upgrades, and there is not a great way to be able to do that. Next slide, please. In the city of Woodland, this is West Main Street. The city has reduced impact fees. They've done comprehensive zoning updates. The Main Street needs sewer water upgrades, in addition to street upgrades, of course, to unlock the potential for 300 new homes. Next slide, please. And then this is North Auburn in the foothills. This particular location is a former Army hospital site. It has a master plan for over 2,000 new homes, but it will need sewer upgrades in order to catalyze that. Next slide, please. So many of these locations, as I said, are on 20th century older suburban commercial corridors where the infrastructure was built for low density suburban strip malls and commercial uses. These places are all over the country. I know the slides I showed you just a few before could have been anywhere. Next slide. But to solve our climate and housing crisis, we need to transform them into walkable, accessible, equitable neighborhoods and places at a much faster pace. And one big piece of context we lost in California over about a decade ago, redevelopment, the ability to do tax increment financing. There is some of that coming back. It's not the same that it was. And so a lot of what we are trying to do here is find new ways of funding the infrastructure that presently there's no other way to do it other than charging impact fees. Next slide, please. And so I think I've got a little bit of oh, there we go. Okay, there's a map of green zone nominations on the screen. So having identified this need that, look, we have infill sites, they have the potential for housing, they have the potential for housing in locationally efficient places, but we can't get any interest or ability for someone to, a developer to come in and build without really, really heavy subsidy. If we could get the funding to pay for the in-ground infrastructure for that, it would catalyze that development. That's our theory of change. And so SAGCOG then asked our members, after doing all of this work, to nominate areas in their communities, location efficient infill areas, to be the focus for infrastructure investment. And 23 of our 28 jurisdictions responded by nominating these green zones. They are those little green spots on the map in front of you. So these are areas where those jurisdictions were saying, this area has space for infill capacity. It's in an area identified in our local plans for infill development. We will do more local policy change to help accelerate that development. And it's in an area, and this is where this regional and local partnership come in. It's in an area where in SAGCOG's long-range transportation plan is identified as either a center or a corridor or an established community. So we have this continuity between what the local community is envisioning and what we need as a region to be able to accomplish. Next slide, please. So these green zones will become eligible for funding from Green Means Go, which Green Means Go is, so we are a metropolitan planning organization. We do transportation planning and funding. We also in California do regional housing needs planning. So we will work with our cities and counties to allocate to them state targets for how much housing needs to be zoned. But up until this point, we've not funded anything outside of transportation. But with this Green Means Go program, what we were identifying in our region was, with our members, is, look, we're trying to implement a vision for sustainable growth in this region that we've had in place for over 15 years, and we have data now to show that we've got major challenges in doing that. And so we have developed this program to be able to overcome that challenge. And so that is what Green Means Go is trying to be. Now, it's to accelerate infill development, which is in location efficient places so that we can increase travel options. And then when travel is occurring by vehicles, that it is clean, and that is what that EV is on the side, that it's electrified. That's what we're trying to do in those green zones. Next slide, please. So I talked about the regional and the local partnership. The really, really important part of it was also trying to get partnership from the state of California. So our regions, MPOs in the state of California have to develop a component of their long-range plan that tries to achieve greenhouse gas reductions from effectively lowering vehicle miles traveled. So how can that region grow more efficiently to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And what we have been advocating to the state was that we want to do that. We see major challenges to being able to do that. And so the part of the state partnership here for Green Means Go was really for the state to bring forth the funding for us. And that just happened this year. In fact, it was the first time that we have a program. It's called the Regional Early Action Planning Program of 2021 for the whole state of California, really inspired by what the Sacramento region was trying to achieve with our Green Means Go program. And so this program that we have been working to create over the last 3 years will now be a reality. And we are looking forward to working with our cities and counties and their community partners to be able to invest it in those green zones. Next slide, please. It's been a journey, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Great, thank you. I'm working on transitioning out. Can folks not, are we out of this screen? Can folks see me? Apologies.
You're on with me and there's no slides.
Okay.
Yes.
That's all I'm going for. Wonderful. Thank you all. So thank you, Casey and Christine, for those really valuable perspectives. I'm going to take a couple of minutes. I'm just going to really tie this together for a short discussion, first on equity and then on the climate implications of what we've talked about today. And then my goal is at about 11 o'clock my time, which is at the hour, whatever time zone you happen to be in, turning it over into the Q&A. So this is your good opportunity to get your questions written out, and we'll be responding to those as we can. So first to the question of equity. So Christine, you highlighted the issue of transit riders by choice versus transit dependent riders. Casey, I think you did a good job of really highlighting the need for diverse types of housing, particularly diverse options for attached housing that really address a diversity of households, incomes, and lifestyles. And so I wanted to turn it over to you. Not to be redundant, but I'd like for you to talk a little bit about how some of the programs that you've highlighted, the efforts that you've highlighted at your respective organizations, how are they raising these equity issues from stakeholders to policymakers? So if either of you want to tackle that question, just kind of highlighting how do we bridge that between these folks who need specific types of housing or different types of housing, are transit dependent, to folks who are making decisions, whether they're at the local level, for example, the elected officials that comprise your governing boards, or perhaps state policymakers.
So I'm going to speak on the housing side of things. It's unfortunately, it's a terrible answer in that our housing crisis is so in your face that it's really hard for anybody to argue that we don't, from the policy perspective, that we don't need to build more affordable and different varied types of housing. I wish it could, I wish it wasn't that there was such a crisis there, but alas, that is in fact what it is on that side of things.
Yeah, and I think I would add to that, like, in addition to it being in your face, like literally you could walk outside the office and on the street, you'll see someone who's camped out, on the sidewalk or in the park. But aside from that being in your face, like the data, I feel like really speaks for itself. And so to the extent that we're able to really bring this information and present it to our boards and to our member agencies and have our communities kind of corroborate the data with their lived experience, I feel like all those things together really just amplify the message.
Yeah.
I would also add to that, because that that shows up and it's so clear. We also have seen here that our policymakers, at least around the SACOG table, which is every single city and county is represented, are taking this seriously. That is how they were able to, unanimously support Green Means Go. And in fact, when it was clear that we were going to get funding in the state budget this year, they adopted a resolution saying when we go for that funding, we will be going for Green Means Go. And they also added to that resolution that the program we develop, because the program we develop is going to address racial equity and economic equity. because that was not, when we started conceiving of this a few years ago, it wasn't in front of them, but seeing everything that as it played out, they wanted to acknowledge and bring that forward, which I think demonstrates quite a bit of leadership there.
Yeah, that's really great to hear. And what I'll also say from being outside of your organizations, that I highlighted earlier how we have a pretty significant political diversity, and you see that in your governing boards. And yet, even with that political diversity, folks are really recognizing that there are impacts to their existing constituents, and so trying to address that. So my next question is around climate. And I think something that's really notable is that California has some very progressive strategies for addressing climate change and resilience. And I wonder if either of you want to talk about how, again, some of the programs that you've highlighted today really seek to address that. So for example, Christine talked about how there are 7 transit operators that work in San Joaquin County, and it's not actually that large of a county. So I would imagine that communities of a comparable size may not have that many. And so just kind of trying to figure out, like, navigating that, for example, especially when you're a transit dependent rider, is that a deterrent? You know, how can we better improve that? And then Casey talked a little bit about how the transportation investment plans and investments in policies are seeking to address not just transportation, but things like electrification infrastructure, as well as infill infrastructure. So I don't know if either of you would like to talk a little bit about how some of these efforts grew out of or were supported by state agencies, or even challenges between locals and state agencies around some of these climate goals.
If I could just go back to the last question, I just wanted to, when we were talking about the political diversity issue, that's definitely something I wanted to touch on really briefly here, is that San Joaquin County is definitely a politically diverse area of California, and oftentimes it's characterized as much more conservative compared to the Bay Area and even Sacramento area. And so when we're talking about equity and inclusion, and even about climate and resilience, if the data doesn't speak for itself enough to our policy board, if the community input doesn't speak loudly enough, oftentimes what staff utilizes as a strategy is leaning on some of the state policies and the state goals, which California is really value forward on equity and climate resilience. And so a lot of times we'll kind of round out the staff's presentations with grounding the recommendations or the policy strategies in what the state's broader goals are. So I just wanted to touch on that really briefly. And then to speak to your question about transit and service improvements, you're right, having 7 different transit operators in San Joaquin County is a huge challenge for anyone who is transit dependent and trying to navigate their way through the region from point A to point B. In a place where jobs are in one part of the region and housing is in another part of the region. That's like part of our landscape here. And the key thing that we did was let's try to make it easier to plan a trip. But aside from that, we're also trying to improve or close the gaps in terms of what our transit service can realistically and financially feasibly deliver. And so what we're trying to do is really think about, how do we get folks in our, outlying suburban areas or in our rural areas connected to the transit network itself. And some of that is, in pilot form right now in San Joaquin County with our deployment of car share services, bike share services, as well as a Van Go program with our regional bus operator. They're kind of zoning out the county and trying to do kind of like an on-demand service from point A to the closest transit center, for example. But all of these things are things that we still need to test and try. And yeah, definitely share outcomes once we have better data on that. Definitely it's been a challenge recently because of COVID's impact on transit ridership altogether, but those are some things that we're testing out here.
And then in the Sacramento region, the programs and activities that we're trying to carry out, Green Means Go being a very big one, kind of a headliner, as well as our our board just adopted a next generation transit strategy, which is trying to look at recovering from the effects of COVID, and then into the future, how to rebuild a transit system to serve the 21st century needs, mobility needs of people. And these are, and then we are also partnered with other agencies within the region on an electric vehicle deployment strategy, really in supporting them with kind of the land use and transportation strategic framework that we develop as the MPO. These are all linked to each other in service of that regional long range plan that SACOG and SJCOG are responsible for developing. And as I'd mentioned, under state law, MPOs have to try to demonstrate a greenhouse gas reduction, really from reducing passenger vehicle trips and or shortening those trips. So it really is this combination of what land use and transportation strategies can we put together to help people to be able to not have to drive so much. And so that's really sort of how a lot of our work unfolds.
Great, thank you both for that perspective. I'm going to turn it over to Rachel to help us through some of the questions that have come up from the attendees.
Can you guys see me? Okay, great. Great, well, thank you guys. That was an absolutely great discussion on just in-migration and out-migration and how we can better retrofit some of our communities that were really designed for suburban growth, for taking on some of that new growth. There's quite a few questions coming through, so I'm going to try and organize some of these. So I'm going to start with some of the transit questions, because I think you guys were just discussing that. So let's see. Okay, so this is about the Green Means Go program, Casey, that you were discussing. So being that Green Means Go, was there an additional need for green space and parks in that as well?
Within those green zones?
Yes.
Yes, we have not explicitly said anything about green spaces within those areas. What I will try to help describe is that the vast majority of these places are, well, they're suburban commercial corridors. There are a few of them that are, smaller downtown areas, but as some of the photos I showed you are very, very typical. And so we have embedded in our work with the local agencies, with the cities and counties, they have local plans and policies that underpin this. So what their open space requirements would be, what their plans for parks and green spaces would be, that is what's embedded within those green zones. So we really try to honor the bottom up policy development efforts of that and marry it to the regional needs, if that makes sense.
Gotcha. There's another question about that, and it is, how are local plans for land use and development of the Green Means Go program funded?
The local plans. So in some cases, a city may have already developed its, a specific plan for a corridor. I showed a picture of Folsom Boulevard in Rancho Cordova. They adopted a specific plan for that area. So in 2006. And so that was funded with their own, their own means of funding that. And what we do think is that there may be some communities who will apply for actual planning funding to Green Means Go because they just were not, especially our smaller cities, they just have not been able to pull that funding together. So that is something that we want to make sure that there's space for them to be able to do that. But we do want to first and foremost find the ones that have made enough progress that they have an infrastructure project ready to go so we can get the housing built.
Okay. There's several questions around the displacement risk assessment that you guys brought up. So I I guess, could you discuss a little bit more around the process for adjusting that approach and whether or not you included people who are experiencing homeless or risk of displacement, in fact, in the new method that you used, or were they included in that process?
Yeah, I think I can speak broadly about the process, and then maybe Bernadette, could you chime in on the methodology itself? So in terms of the process, what we were really trying to do with the project in San Joaquin County is to kind of take a look under the hood at the methodology itself, but with more locally based baseline data, for example, like our area median income, our housing prices, and so on and so forth. And in addition to that, in the UDP model, there weren't any local or regional voices from San Joaquin County that helped inform the methodology. And so part of our process was to take the map out and basically show it to varying stakeholders in the region. Some of that was at the local jurisdiction level with our cities and the county. Some of that was with our housing advocate groups representing those who are experiencing housing instability. And I think we did also reach out to the homeless representatives, but I might have to defer to Bernadette to confirm. So we did try to reach as many voices as possible to give input on the map itself and to inform, what are the factors that are really driving housing instability in San Joaquin County. I'll pass it to Bernadette to talk more about the maps.
Yeah, I mean, so first what I'll talk about is, which I thought was a great process. We had a national nonprofit, which was Enterprise, our university research center, and of course the MPO, SJCOG. And regarding the outreach, our colleagues at Enterprise really did the outreach. And what we really focused on was working with the organizations. So rather than specifically reaching out to residents of affordable housing developments or organizations where people who are experiencing homelessness are receiving services or shelter, we really worked with some of those groups. But we really absolutely worked with the advocacy groups that are really looking at, again, displacement and homelessness. So while outreach didn't hit residents specifically, they did absolutely bring in those perspectives. So that was part of some of the outreach and engagement work that informed how to best develop the tool. And then more to the methodology, just in today's conversation, you're probably getting a sense that the Bay Area and Central Valley communities are just very, very different. And so, I'll raise the example I provided earlier, where the area median, so average basically income, a four-person household in San Francisco was $133,000 a year and $75,000 a year in San Joaquin. And so when we talk about displacement, it looks very different. So for example, with the former model that we were looking at, that really was developed more for kind of an urban and higher cost area than the San Joaquin area, places would not register as being at risk for gentrification and displacement. And that absolutely did not match with the lived experience of the people who are in those areas. And so we sought to look at some additional indicators. And so I'd be happy to talk a little bit more. It's a little bit wonky, but I'm happy to talk a little bit more about how we did that. But we looked at not just the urban displacement project, which was fantastic and really fit a lot of the pieces we were looking at. We looked at some other comparable projects for Los Angeles, Denver, Colorado, and then a project looking at displacement in New York City and Seattle. And so for those, we looked at what indicators they looked at and determined a couple of typologies, and I'll just kind of give you the names of them. Low income or susceptible to displacement, that's kind of one end of the spectrum, and then moving along the spectrum, ongoing displacement of low income households. The next step up would be at risk of gentrification. The next would be early ongoing gentrification. The next level up is advanced gentrification. And then we had, so those are sort of those risk areas that were highlighted in the darker kind of blue and purple colors. And then the orange colors, if you recall on the list, looked at these typologies: stable, moderate, or mixed income, The next one was at risk of becoming exclusive. The next step was becoming exclusive, and then the highest level was stable or advanced exclusive. So there wasn't a lot of change because they were already significantly higher cost housing with some of the highest income populations. I don't know how much I want to get into that too much, but maybe I'll pause there and see if there's additional questions that come up related to that.
Sorry, I was muted. There's several questions around like additional resources and data, but I think we can get to that, you know, a little bit later if you guys have any links or resources that you can share towards the end. There are several questions around infill, so I kind of want to transition into that. A couple of different folks have questions on, you know, what challenges have you guys faced with selling infill to elected officials in neighborhoods? Do you find that it's the properties that are unattractive for infill, or they're reluctant property owners? Like, what are some of the challenges that you guys have seen with that infill strategy?
So this part of why we had the green zones be locally nominated is so that they were really like truly coming from the community that's going to have to be making those decisions. And I should say an important piece of background is that in the Sacramento region, we have a history going back nearly 20 years where we had a very intensive growth visioning effort across the region that really set out a long-term growth strategy that kicked off a lot of cities and counties doing pretty significant general updates to their comprehensive plans, identifying places for infill development. And so part of what you are seeing with these green zones is really the legacy of that we've had, you know, not to say that it's easy, but we've had an effort to promote and encourage the infilling of these suburban, you know, areas that are meeting the end of their useful life for quite some time. Now, all that said, you know, with the community, that I think that there is always a need for engagement because you have people who just have not been involved before, or they've just recently moved here. And so I think if you picked up on some of what Christine is proposing, that, you know, in her presentation of just significant community outreach, that I think from an MPO perspective, that's not so much us as so much as it's more our, you know, local government partners, right? There's that, and then there is, you know, with our elected officials, we have the benefit of every single city county being on our board, and so we have a constant briefing and education, you know, process on the benefits of infill, you know, kind of year to year almost, because we will sometimes have, you know, turnover of elected officials. It's an ongoing thing, and so you know, I think what comes down to the root of it is, look, you've got communities, right? This is the thing about suburban communities everywhere. They were built for a particular time with a particular, you know, reason. And it was like, hey, great, new growth, it's going in, it's going to be awesome. And there was never a thought of really, truly how to maintain that. And so now I think every community is really forced to figure out, how do we fix the crumbling infrastructure? You know, how do we, like, you know, take care of some of this, you know, underutilized spaces, like, you know, that can end up just, you know, being a hazard in some cases, right? But also just trying to bring some investment into the community that can be beneficial to the community. That's something that we're, like, in the suburban sort of context, I don't know, it would be interesting to know from anyone here, like, I don't think we're that great at it as a society, because we're sort of on the tip of really feeling, you know, what that is to have these aging, you know, suburban places. At least, you know, I'll speak maybe much more for California, because that's, you know, that's my context. I think I think talking about how do we make a win-win for the members of the community and for the local, for the municipality, it has to maintain all of that. I think that's been also a really important resonant message for our electeds.
If I can chime in, so I actually was an infill developer for 3 years, so I know this a lot. And so one thing I just want us to think about is using those lessons to inform our future, lessons from history to inform our future. And what I mean by that is we often would talk about how it was doubly so. On one hand, we talked about how you would be collecting these impact fees and have a sugar rush of fees when you saw new construction, particularly in these far-flung areas. The challenge is when you build out those areas, we know that there's a mismatch between the fees that were collected and the maintenance and upkeep over generations and over decades. And so, you know, particularly jurisdictions, you know, it's easy to approve these and do and collect fees, and then again, they're not being a good match. So kind of thinking about like the nexus there. And the implications of that in the long term, because now we're seeing that come out to bear. But one of the challenges is, in that respect, it's easier to do new construction, particularly in sort of greenfield or leapfrog development styles. With infill, the challenges is there's many challenges, particularly retrofitting, to the climate point, retrofitting older systems. And so what I'll say, sort of my challenge is, as we see funding coming through this infrastructure package that's just been approved at the federal level, can we reinvest that? And so I'll say that I think that in these bedroom communities that we're talking about, places like Stockton and the city of Sacramento really benefited from funding from the state just prior to the last housing crisis, where they were able to invest in the infrastructure needed so that they would encourage more infill development. So of course, what I'm saying is the answer is always more money, but if we have this opportunity to do federal investment, can we reinvest in the infrastructure to encourage infill development, including in suburban areas, rather than using that infrastructure to just support more of the type of unsustainable land use patterns that we know are not going to help with climate change goals?
Yeah, actually, to that point, Bernadette, I mean, let's not forget that the federal government did invest in infrastructure and housing after World War II, and that's what fueled our suburban expansion. So can we learn from, you know, at some point, housing was considered an imperative such that it was invested in that to that extent. So.
Yeah, there's I think you made a great point, and I think that resonates with a lot of communities that are you know, trying to advance infill development strategies. There is definitely that need for infrastructure, but then there's that challenge of it's affordable development, affordable housing development can't take on the cost of that, and so they're kind of pushed to the outskirts. There's a couple questions around tax increment financing, and I guess I don't know, Bernadette, if you mentioned this or who mentioned it, but that you guys were losing tax increment financing.
Well, Casey mentioned it, but Bernadette's going to answer the question to start
Bernadette
with.
should answer it.
Okay. All right.
Is there a particular question or set of questions around that? Yeah. What happened? The question
it's just, does California have tax increment financing? What's the loss there?
Yeah, so and this did align again with the last big economic downturn. I don't know, I'm losing track of economic downturns during my very young career, so the last one. But the reason I answer this is because I worked for the local redevelopment agency for Sacramento City and County for 5 years. And at that time, so what was happening at the Capitol was there's this challenge where there's a sense that funds that were collected were not being kind of redistributed from the local government level. And so in my mind, it was sort of like there were no winners out of this situation. So California had a long and robust history of tax increment financing. and they were funded through local redevelopment agencies, the city and county. There also were a couple of others. For example, our capital area has its own sort of redevelopment agency, and they were able to collect and leverage tax increment financing. But a significant state policy change came about in December of 2011, and I'll tell you why I know that date. But it came about in December of 2011, so pretty promptly in 2012, tax increment financing went away. And so it really hamstrung our ability to do this kind of work. I mean, the redevelopment funds, redevelopment agencies, which were really tasked with a lot of this sort of infrastructure investment and supporting, for example, affordable housing and infill development, they just really lacked the resources. So they that ended up making them much more dependent on federal funding and state funding. One sort of solution has been, you may have heard that in 2017 and then again in this year in 2021, there were these packages of state funding, historic level, many different pieces of legislation that addressed funding and policy changes to really stimulate the development of affordable housing. And I mentioned why I know it was December 2011 is because I was working at the redevelopment agency and was 8.5 months pregnant with my second child when I got laid off from the redevelopment agency. And just to give you a sense of what that was like, I think it was within a couple of months, within like a 3-month period, I think 2/3 of the employees were let go. It was really hard. So not only did we lose tax increment financing, but we really lost a lot of that kind of institutional knowledge to do that work. So solutions have now been that there is more funding from the state to support housing, and then also some funding from the state to support some infrastructure work, notably things like water and energy infrastructure, for example.
And this question, I'm just going to read it as it came in, because it's a little bit longer. So in targeting commercial arterial frontages for residential infill, have you had to address property owners still holding out for the higher per square foot prices for commercial development, since that is presumably still allowed in those zones? And is there a way to tip the scale in favor of residential on former commercial sites?
My audio cut out halfway through that question, but I think the first part it was, how are commercial property owners responding to attempts at revitalizing these commercial
to transition it to residential? They want the higher money. What recommendations do you have to kind of tip the scale of residential on former commercial sites?
Yeah, it's so that's always, I think that challenge is never going to go away. And so I will fully disclose, I do not work with those property owners directly. I have worked with some brilliant people in economic development and, just kind of urban strategists who have. And they will always say, you got to start by building a relationship. And I think that, you got to start by doing that. I would also say in general, like, we've done this at a jurisdictional level, but finding the champions, right? Finding the local champions is so important. So maybe there is a property owner, maybe there's a business owner. I'll say we have one of our commercial corridors in Sacramento County there's a business owner there who just loves that community and is fired up about making that particular corridor, it's Greenback Lane, an amazing place, and led the charge to get a property and business improvement district set up, so all of the businesses would tax themselves so they could start to invest in the streetscape there, and set up the Chamber of Commerce. Those champions, right? Either find them or cultivate them. That's that.
And this is Bernadette again. I'll chime in with another thing. Again, this is a California context. Housing makes so much more per square foot than the rent on housing is way more per square foot than office, retail, and industrial. And that's, in my mind, exacerbated by the pandemic, where the question of what's the future of retail? Are people going back to the office, making it even more challenging? So it's sort of a unique situation where in some of these communities, the question is, how do we retain the neighborhood serving retail that these communities need, like food security, like a grocery store, and so we actually have sort of the opposite problem, and that issue is compounded by, again, a couple of things that I think are particularly, maybe not unique to our area, but it's a unique situation. With the rise of cannabis, there's a lot more pressures on industrial areas. So if you look at, trying to kind of retrofit industrial adjacent to residential areas, you do have the challenges of cannabis warehousing and distribution centers, which is, a somewhat new and growing industry in California. And then the other issue is around the online retail, and particularly in the Central Valley, the warehousing and logistics aspects. So you have these sort of like, usually small business storefronts, not able to compete. So you have major sort of corporate entities that are able to compete, but it's hard to keep some of that neighborhood serving retail in these suburban corridors. So that's the thing, is when you have anchors leave of the suburban retail, folks aren't taking up those spaces. So I think it's definitely what Casey's saying about developing a relationship from an economic development perspective with potential developers, particularly developers who are going to build the kind of thing that your community thinks they need. But then it's also not just what you're building, but how are you retaining the tenants that you're hoping to retain?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that ties into kind of this next section, going back to the displacement risk assessment. Like what are the next steps for that project, to retain, the people that live in those communities, not just the residences and but also the businesses. What's the next step in that project?
I think this is a question for Christine, but I'll, seeing as I jumped into every other last question, why stop now? So we're definitely working on the last sort of components of that particular project, which involves creating a report to SJCOG and their governing board around what are some of the implications and essentially recommendations of what happens next. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Christine, because I can tell you what's starting to appear in there, but I'm curious to hear what their plans are for moving this report to their governing board and then acting on it.
Yeah, so one of the key things that's coming through with the report is a policy menu, something for our local jurisdictions to take a look at and kind of pick and choose from the menu, so to speak, on things that they're ready to implement at the local level. In addition to that, there's also going to be a set of recommendations for SJCOG as the regional entity to be thinking about how we are mitigating any displacement effects that are linked to some of our long-range transportation investment that's in our regional plan. Most specifically, I'm kind of thinking about, we're thinking about our long-range regional transit investment, specifically the rail, commuter rail that we're hoping to, link to the BART system in the Bay Area, and eventually extend up to Sacramento and then down through the Central Valley. And so these are some really significant rail investments that are foreseeable within the next 10 to 20 years in our region. And from the literature, we understand that there are implications at the local level. And as the transportation funder agency in San Joaquin County, like, there is kind of this responsibility to make sure that the transit investments that we're making really serve and benefit the residents who really need the service. Because as I mentioned, our transit dependent population is really, that's who rides transit in San Joaquin County. And so that's, forefront in our mind in terms of next steps. And, a key thing that we're trying to kind of remind our local jurisdictions as they, prepare to, plan for more units than they've ever had to plan for before, is that, you know, the state resources that are coming down the pipeline, the Regional Early Action Planning Grant that Casey mentioned earlier, we have a unique opportunity at this point in time to really think about how an investment in our region could really catalyze and support development along our transit corridors. So those are kind of the key things that we're looking forward to here in our region.
Awesome. And just as like a last question to wrap up before I turn it over to Christine Davis, what are some, for communities who are looking to get started on some policy changes or just get the conversation going, what are some kind of practical first steps you might recommend that they take? And that's whoever wants to take that.
I say learn the history of your community. I feel like you can learn a lot from just looking 50 years back, 100 years back, at how the place that you're currently working in like was shaped by state, federal, and local policy. You know, Casey and Bernadette alluded to, you know, the 1950s policies around transportation and housing. Like, I feel like those are legacies in our urban landscape today, and you know, starting there can really be very informative on how to move forward.
Okay, I've got a great compliment to that one. So then after, because that is a good one, understanding your history, and then what is the likely future in your community if you don't do anything else? To be able to understand that compared to what is the vision, what are the values that your, you know, community has espoused, and this is, you know, is it in your comprehensive plans? Is it, you know, where is that housed already, so that you can compare how are we actually doing in trying to realize that? Because I do think it's not as easy as, you know, it's not because we say it happens, and I think that knowing that will help them to decide, okay, how might we need to change in order to get on track.
And I'll chime in with changing the narrative around displacement. Oops, sorry, I'm sharing the wrong screen. That's okay. I was trying to share another screen. Here it is. So I'm sharing a screen, and I'll go through this in a minute with some of these resources, but changing the narrative around gentrification, because on one hand, as we've alluded to this earlier, it's like, oh, great, we have people with higher incomes moving in, they're gonna have more spending power, where they're gonna drive up housing costs, which is gonna increase land values, which is gonna increase sales, property tax, sales tax. And so really changing that narrative, and one very simple piece of advice I've given folks is talk about your constituents, like how is this affecting our current constituents? Can they afford to retire here? Can their adult children afford to live here? So changing that, and then I'll just scroll through this quickly. These were some of the comparisons we looked at. So if you're interested in the Bay Area, which we talked about, Southern California, which has one, this is the New York one, the Displacement Alert Project. Denver, Colorado came up, the University of Colorado, Denver came up with this particular area. And then this one on these areas, and then the Seattle Displacement Risk Project. So sorry, I kind of zoomed through that.
All right, thank you guys. Christine, do you want to wrap us up?
Yeah, can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay, great. All right. Oh, this was great. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I was just kind of looking through the questions. And thank you, Rachel, for moderating today, since I have two little munchkins here with me today. A lot of really great questions that are coming through. So just as a reminder, we are recording this session. We'll post it up on our YouTube channel. I'll also post a PDF of the slide deck. So that will be available for you. So then you can also see some contact information as well if you'd like to reach out to our great panelists here to talk further. I really appreciate all of you today, and thank you to the Housing and Community Development Division for hosting. Everyone, this is it for 2021. This is our last session. I think we're going out with a bang with, you know, over 500 participants on the line today. We'll have sessions for 2022 in the next 2 weeks or so. I'll have them posted. We're booking well into March now, so we are not void of sessions coming into 2022. We are coming in strong this coming year. So anyway, thanks everyone again, and have a great year end, a great holiday, stay safe, and we'll talk in the new year. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.